The teaching that you're about to hear this morning is part of our year-long campaign that we are calling the Year of Biblical Literacy. You can find out more over on our website at midtownbiblicalliteracy.com, and there you can find reading plans, resources, podcast episodes, all in an effort to help us raise our understanding of the Bible. So with that in mind, enjoy this teaching.
Welcome to the gathering, y'all. Our scripture today is Ruth 2, 1 through 3. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. Y'all may have a seat.
Ruth chapter 2. All right, let's recap what we saw last week as we started our series walking through the book of Ruth. We met two of our main characters last week, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi's husband is Elimelech. They took their sons and they left Bethlehem to move to Moab in the time of the judges and in the midst of a famine. We aren't told exactly what their motives are, but we know a few things. We know that the time of the judges was a generally lawless time. Everyone is doing what was right in their own eyes. There's just pervasive arrogance and disregard for God and God's ways. Secondly, we know that generally no one moves to a foreign country. No one immigrates in hopes of a worse life. That's not what you do. You move to a new country hoping for a better life, and that adds up with the fact that it was in the time of a famine, so they're moving somewhere they think their life will go better. And then third, we know that they gave their boys Canaanite names and that both of their sons married foreign women who didn't know and worship God, which is overtly against God's law, according to Deuteronomy 7:3. And so the implication of all those narrative details is that they didn't move for good and faithful reasons. And in roughly 10 years, all of their plans and hopes and dreams fall apart. All of Naomi's and Elimelech's dreams of a better life are crushed. Naomi loses her husband first, Elimelech dies, and then roughly 10 years later, both of her sons die as well. So Naomi is left in a foreign land with her two foreign daughters-in-law. She decides to return home to Bethlehem because she's heard that the famine is over there, and she tells her daughters-in-law to leave her. Orpah does, Ruth won't. Ruth commits herself to Naomi and says, "I'm going wherever you go." And as we talked about last week, more than anything, she actually is covenanting to Naomi's God. She's committing herself to Naomi's God and committing to Naomi herself. And that's where we are picking it up in Ruth chapter 2. Ruth 2, we'll start in verse 1. We're going to read through the whole chapter, kind of unpack it as we go. Ruth 2, starting in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz, okay? We just met our third main character in the book of Ruth. His name is Boaz. That's an unfortunate name, but he's a great guy, okay? The author is spotlighting him before he even enters into the action of the story. The author of the book of Ruth is saying, hey, keep your eyes on this guy. Two things that we note in his introduction right here. First, he's described as a worthy man. In the Hebrew, it's Ish Gibor Hayil. Can be translated a man of great worth or great strength, great power, great wealth. As we will see in our story, Boaz is going to live up to this introduction of being a worthy man. He is a direct contrast to the most of the people in the time of the judges. Everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes, but Boaz is a worthy man. He honors God. He obeys God, as we'll continue to see. The second thing that we're told about Boaz is that he is from the clan of Elimelech. He's related in some way to Naomi's dead husband. This will be especially important over the next 2 weeks. I just wanted to note it for you now. As we're studying through the book, you can make a note of that. It's going to be really important. Let's keep going. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Okay, so we've got our leading man, that's Boaz, and now we've got Ruth's plan. Those rhyme, so you know it's true. Ruth says, I'm going to go glean in the fields. And I don't know how familiar you are with reapers and gleaners. It starts to sound a little bit like a dystopian young adult novel. Let me just explain these two categories of agricultural workers, okay? Reapers are hired field workers. They have a job. They have employment. They're bringing in the harvest. They're reaping the harvest. And for them, this would be a very joyous time with this harvest because they're coming out of a long famine. So there's a lot of joy and hope and anticipation with this harvest. By contrast, gleaners are poor people with no job and no land. What they would do is they would go out in the field and follow behind the reapers, hoping to pick up whatever little scraps of grain were left over that the reapers had missed. Okay, that was the difference. It's worth noting here, this wasn't just some weird cultural activity or practice. Gleaning was actually a God-ordained system that's outlined in Leviticus 19 as well as in Deuteronomy. It's a sort of welfare to work program where God told his people to intentionally leave the edges of their fields unharvested. In other words, he told his people intentionally leave some profits on the table so that the poor, the disenfranchised, the jobless could come behind you and have something to eat. They could have some grain for themselves and their families. So this system of gleaning is a picture of God's heart and his concern for the poor. He built into the laws of his people a pathway for the poor and disenfranchised to provide for themselves. I think that's beautiful. Think about it a different way. God commanded that business owners not simply focus on maximizing their profits. Not simply focus on their bottom line. If you own a business or you're in some kind of management, I think that's worth considering. I don't know exactly what it means for you, but I know it doesn't mean nothing. Are there ways that you can refuse to bow to the God of maximizing your bottom line and align your practices with God's heart for the poor, for the disenfranchised, for the marginalized? How could you intentionally incorporate that into your business plan? I don't know that answer for you, but I know that you should have one. Now, as you think about that, you also might imagine this was a bit of a tough law for landowners to obey. Leave potential profits on the table just so the poor might come behind and have some for themselves, especially this year. Because they're coming out of a famine. How easy would it have been to justify, okay, yeah, well, not this year. This year, we've got to make up for lost time. It's been tough. We've got to get everything we can out of this harvest. But at the same time, there would have been even more in need of that gleaning practice, wouldn't there have been? And this is important, in the law, in Leviticus 19, there's a provision that included foreigners. It included the sojourner. It was a way God commanded his people to be hospitable and generous to outsiders. Now, remind me who in our story just so happens to be a non-Jewish foreigner. Ruth. It's easy because it's the name of the whole book. Okay, good. Ruth. And Ruth, let me tell you, Ruth jumps on the opportunity to glean, which tells us something about her, because gleaning was hard work. Hot work, demanding physical work, and it was dangerous work for a single woman from a foreign country. She's at higher risk to be mistreated, to be robbed, and or to be taken advantage of, to be assaulted in multiple different ways. So multiple different people in our story will reference the danger of being assaulted that she's under. So this is a risky and a courageous plan that Ruth is undergoing to help provide for herself and for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Pick it back up in verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Remember, we just met him 2 verses ago. Now he's entering into the story. Okay. As English readers, we miss something huge that just happened in the storytelling, and it's intentional. Okay. That phrase, I'm going to spotlight it for you on the screen. And she happened to come. She happened to come. In the Hebrew, that is 2 different words that both mean happen or chance. It could literally be translated, she chanced to chance. Or how we might say it in modern English, as luck would have it. Or little did she know. It's a fun little literary technique, right? Where the author is giving you a little wink, wink. Some Sophoclean or dramatic irony is happening here where the audience knows something that the character doesn't know, but that's going to have a serious impact on the character's life. Let me just make sure you know. The author absolutely does not believe that chance has anything to do with this. It's a wink. It's a nudge. It's a, hey, pay attention. It's chance to happen. The author believes in chance like I believe in Nancy Pelosi's incredible skills at picking stocks. She doesn't. And she happened to come as chance, little did she know. Mark that phrase. We're going to come back to that. That's actually one of the huge main points of this entire chapter. And the narrative timing here is beautiful. Again, we don't know if this was the first field that Ruth came to or the 50th, but look at verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. As chance chanced, behold, Boaz. As luck would have it, little did she know, she just happened into the field of our new main character, Boaz. Can you believe that? The NVIDIA stock that Pelosi invested in skyrocketed? What? I never saw it coming. That, by the way, that's not like a political joke aimed at one side of the aisle. Or none of them should be able to invest. We're off topic. Here we go. You should follow their moves, though. You can do it. Check it out. I think it's on the internet. Okay, we're about to learn about our man Boaz, okay? And I want you to pay attention to all of the narrative details that expand on his introduction as a worthy man. Pick it back up, continuing in verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. So it appears to be a regular greeting between Boaz and his workers, which means that God isn't just like a once-a-week temple ritual for Boaz. He sees God's presence at work in his daily life. He sees God's blessing and his presence in the midst of his fields and in the faces of his workers. He appears to be respected by his workers. Whether they believe in God or not, they respect his love for God. Keep going, verse 5. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So here's the second thing we know. Boaz is observant. He instantly recognizes that someone new is working with his crew in his fields. Keep going, verse 6. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. She's working hard. She's barely taking any time off at all. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in any other field, in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? He's acknowledging the danger. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. I want to point out to you 3 incredible, beautiful things in Boaz's treatment of Ruth that we see here, okay? The first one is this. He provides gladly. He provides gladly. So Boaz would have known the law about gleaning. He's a God-fearing man. He's aware of the system God set up. But Boaz doesn't just say, sure, you can take a little off the edges. I guess that's fine. He says, my field is the only field for you. Stay here. Don't go anywhere else. Let my field provide everything you need. We'll see more on this in a little bit later, but he goes above and beyond the minimum requirements of the law because he understands God's heart in the law. It's beautiful. Number 2, he uses his power to protect. Boaz knows that gleaning could be dangerous work, especially for a young, single, foreign woman. So he goes out of his way to tell everyone, Ruth has my protection. Do not mess with Ruth. Do not touch Ruth. It's beautiful. Number 3, he inverts cultural norms to dignify the marginalized. So you may or may not have caught this, but when Boaz instructs Ruth to drink what the men have drawn, that's a wildly countercultural instruction. The norm of the day was for the foreign women, foreigners, to draw water for Israelite women, and Israelite women would draw water for Israelite men. The practice was not in God's law. It was just the norm of the day. And it was a reminder to foreigners, you're at the bottom. You're the servants of the servants who serve others. You go last. You draw for everyone else before you get a sip of water. And Boaz flips it. He tells Ruth, you drink what the men draw. They can serve you. He's making it clear to everyone, I don't care that Ruth is a foreigner. I don't care that she's a Moabite. She's one of our enemies. You won't look down on her. She's here in my field, and everyone in my field gets treated with dignity and respect. Once again, he's reflecting God's heart for the poor, for the foreigner, for the sojourner. Now, to be clear, this is not a sermon about masculinity. But I would like to point out and take just a minute to note that in Boaz, we find a pretty great example of godly masculinity. I don't know if you're picking up on that or not, but that's noteworthy because I'm aware that in much of American media and culture, the assumption is that men are incompetent morons at best or power-hungry, misogynistic villains at worst. And there aren't really many other options. And I would just like to point out to you here that Boaz is an example of admirable, inspirational, godly masculinity. He isn't a perfect man, but he is a worthy man. He isn't a sinless man, but he's a man who loves God. He honors God. He obeys God's laws, and he goes beyond God's laws, reflecting God's heart in his laws. He's a man who has his life together. He's stable. He provides for himself and for many around him. He uses his resources to bless others. He looks out for the weak, the marginalized, the poor. He's a man who respects and honors and protects women. He's a godly, worthy man. This is a picture of what godly responsibility and character look like. And I point that out because more and more people are realizing that young men especially are struggling in our culture. It seems that part of that might be that we consistently tell young men that their strength is dangerous and problematic and it is the problem. That's totally wrong. The problem is not the strength itself, it's how you use it. Men in the room, especially younger men, I want to say out loud to you in this microphone that your strength and your abilities and whatever positions of power God puts you in are God-given and wonderful and needed in our broken world. You have the potential to be a blessing to everyone who happens to happen into your path. And in Christ, that is your high calling, to be like Boaz, to use your strength and power and whatever assets you have to be a blessing to others, so that others are glad you possess the strength that you do, because without it, you could not have blessed them the way that you have. I want more men like that. I want to be a man like that. I want women in our church whose lives are filled with men like that. Women who pray for and encourage the men in their lives, their fathers, their friends, their husbands and sons, to live like that, their brothers. Okay, it's not a sermon about masculinity. If it was, those are some of the things I would have said in it, but it's not. Keep reading, verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Ruth's pronounced response helps us understand just how gracious and godly Boaz's actions are. She falls on her face. She lays in front of him. Who am I to receive this kind of favor, this kind of grace? Why did you notice me at all? I'm a foreigner. I'm a nobody. I don't deserve this. This is going to cost you. Boaz's grace is met with Ruth's humility, and it's a beautiful combination. Grace and humility are a beautiful combination. That's true for them as literal humans who are part of the story, and it's true at a bigger level, that the right response to grace is humility and to receive it with gladness. Keep reading verse 11. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz says, I've heard about you. I know about you. So your reputation precedes you. So Ruth and Naomi are the talk of the town. And if you grew up in a small town, you may know what this is like. For better or worse, Ruth and Naomi, they're the buzz. Everyone's humming about them. But for Boaz, it's for the better. He says, I heard about how you forsook the very reasonable act of staying in your homeland. That would have been totally reasonable for you to have stayed with your mom, to stay with your dad, to stay with your connections, to stay in your land, but you didn't. You passed that up to connect yourself to Naomi, to make sure she was taken care of. You gave up everything to attach yourself to Naomi and to her God. That's incredible. Now remember, for them, lineage is everything. And Naomi has none left. Her husband is dead. Her sons are dead. If Ruth does not attach herself to Naomi, Naomi has no options. She's too old to work. She's too old to have children. She's out of options. She's out of luck. But Ruth says, no, I'm with you. And Boaz is blown away by this. The sacrifice she went through to make life possible. As a foreigner, to make the blessing and refuge she offered to Naomi. He's blown away by it. And what does he say? He seems to acknowledge that Ruth has entrusted herself not just to Naomi, but to God and his care and his refuge and his protection. So he says, whatever reward I can give you is small compared to what I'm praying that God does for you. Whatever I give to you, the blessing and refuge I offer is a small token of the blessing and refuge I hope you are finding in him. Verse 13, then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servant. More humility from Ruth. She actually repeats a phrase that she said back in verse 10. She says, I have found favor in your eyes. I don't know if you caught this or remember this, but back in verse 2, when Ruth told Naomi her plan, she said, I'm going to go glean in hopes that I find favor in someone's eyes. And now her prayers are being answered yes. God is providing for her. He's answering. Her hopes and dreams are attached to a risky plan. I hope I end up in a field where someone would show me favor. She has. Verse 14, it keeps getting better. Verse 14, and at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So I want to make sure we're all catching something here. I've heard some pastors who teach this whole book and this part primarily in terms of romantic attraction and dating advice, and they turn this into Ruth and Boaz's first date. And to that, I would just say, no, thank you. That's not what's going on here. That's not the emphasis of what's happening. What's happening here is we're continuing to see Boaz's godly character. He doesn't have to eat with his employees, but he wants to. He's a man of the people. And he's making sure that Ruth is getting settled and adjusted. He's showing her hospitality. He's saying, hey, here's how we do meals. Here's how we eat. Here's how we dip. Come, enjoy. So that no one could possibly give her a hard time. He's her host. He's the one showing this kindness and this favor and this gladness. His generosity keeps elevating. He tells his crew, don't just let her glean from the edges. Let her glean from among the sheaves, the big bundles of the good grain. Let her get the stuff that falls out there. In fact, go beyond that and intentionally pull some of the best grain out of the bundles and just leave it there on accident so she can glean it. That's beautiful. And she's not just going to get the scrap from the edges. She's going to get some of the best grain. He says, don't tell her to stop. Help her out. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, which I think we all know is about a 30-pound sack. And she took it up and went into the city. At the end of the day, the result of Boaz's generosity is that Ruth has had a delicious lunch to the full. She was fully satisfied with leftovers, and she now has about 30 pounds of grain to bring home with her too. Good grain too, not janky grain from the edges of the field. And Ruth, I would just say Ruth is a beast. She pulls up that 30-pound satchel. I'm walking home. I don't care how long the walk is. I'm carrying it. That's awesome. She leaves Boaz's field. I want you to check out Naomi's response, Ruth's mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. That's from the lunch meal. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. She's stumbling over her words with excitement. Where did you glean? Where did you work? Blessed be that man. This is incredible. No matter what possible hopes and prayers she had, she never in a million years imagined Ruth was coming home with 30 pounds of good grain and leftovers. It's more than she could have expected. Do you see the profound effect this report is having on her? Keep reading. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. This is Naomi? Y'all remember her from chapter 1? In chapter 1, I'm totally empty. I've got nothing. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Don't call me Naomi. Just call me Mara. Call me bitter. There's nothing pleasant about my life. That's where we were 1 page ago. And God's provision, God's grace, God's kindness is starting to melt her heart. Now she's asking God to bless Boaz, and she's remembering that God's kindness doesn't forsake his people. This is drastic change. There's another little note here in the next part of that, verse 20. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. We don't have time to unpack it today. We will unpack this a lot next week. You might want to go ahead and mark it. This idea of being a redeemer is going to be very important to the story and where it's going over the next 2 weeks. For now, just know it that in their culture, there was a system possible where a family member could marry a widow for her provision and her protection. But the Redeemer had to agree to be a Redeemer and bear the financial and the relational costs of providing for the redeemed. We're not getting into it today. We'll save that for next week. Keep going. Verse 21. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. It wasn't just today, Naomi. It's the rest of the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. This is the second notion of the danger that Ruth faced in her risky plan. Verse 23, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. End scene for chapter 2. Ruth continues to work with Boaz's crew. She continues gleaning until the end of the harvest. This is likely for the next 2 to 3 months. Her total risk of we have no way to provide has become security for at least the next few months, with, we assume, a continued abundance of generosity that's going to provide for them well after the harvest is over. Naomi and Ruth have gone from destitute to at least their immediate and a little bit of their future needs are provided for. They're going to have a savings account by the end of this. Ruth's trust and attachment to the Lord has started to turn to blessing, and Naomi's heart has started to soften and heal. That's the end of chapter 2. Here's the question that I want to ask you. What happened that led to all of this incredible change? What is the driving force for all of the change that we see in Ruth chapter 2? Where did this amazing provision and protection for Ruth and Naomi come from? Some different answers, some different things you could think on. Here's how I want to sum it all up. The answer to that question is God's extraordinary faithfulness at work in his people's ordinary faithfulness. God's extraordinary, his miraculous, his supernatural faithfulness at work in his people's ordinary faithfulness. So we hinted at this earlier. None of this is an accident. None of Ruth 2 actually happens by chance. Ruth happened into Boaz's field. Literal translation is chance to chance. Come on, get out of here with that. That ain't chance chancing. That is God working and moving behind the scenes, the invisible hand of God, the invisible character that we talked about last week. God's setting this whole thing up. He has not forsaken his people. Despite all that they've done to deserve to be forsaken, he has stayed faithful. He's bringing the outsider in and giving them, in this case, physical salvation, but also a spiritual salvation where Ruth is getting welcomed in to God's family. And what is the primary means that he uses? The ordinary faithfulness of his people. We see it in Boaz. He's a godly, worthy man who is not doing what is right in his own eyes, but doing what is right in God's eyes. He's a man just going about his business, literally owning and operating a farm, walking into his field, seeing and noticing a vulnerable young woman gleaning out there and saying, "Who is that woman? How might I meet some needs for her?" That's just ordinary faithfulness. We also see it in Ruth. Ruth sees an opportunity to work, to provide for Naomi, and she takes it. Even though it's hard work, even though it's dangerous work, she entrusts herself to God's provision, and she takes the opportunity in front of her, even though there are some risks involved. If you think about it, Naomi does almost nothing in this chapter, and yet her needs are met. She's provided for by the ordinary faithfulness of Boaz and Ruth. That's beautiful. That is a picture of the gospel, where we bring nothing to the table but our need, but our emptiness, but the fact that we are out of options, and God in his grace and his extraordinary faithfulness and provision says, "I got you covered. I can meet your needs. I don't need you to do anything to earn it." And what is often the primary means by which he goes about providing that extraordinary faithfulness? It's the ordinary faithfulness of his people. Put it another way. Ruth and Boaz, their ordinary faithfulness becomes the means by which God provides his extraordinary faithfulness to Naomi. And I want you to catch that. Like think about it like this. Do you think Boaz woke up one morning, circa 1150 BC, brushed his teeth, thought, "I really do have a regrettable name," and then he said to himself, "Yep, though, despite my silly name, today is the day I make it into the Bible"? Of course not. Of course not. He's just living his life in a God-honoring way. He just happened to own a field and employ others in a godly way. And when young Ruth just happened to walk into his field, he just happened to be in a place to provide for and to protect her and to help her. Are y'all catching it? Chance didn't just chance. Rather, God used Boaz's ordinary faithfulness. God uses his character and his obedience as a tool in his divine hands to provide supernatural protection and provision and help to Ruth and Naomi. God's care for Ruth and Naomi takes the form of Boaz's care for them. I hope you're catching where I'm going with this, that I hope this is all an inspiring and an exhilarating wake-up call to you, that the ordinary ho-hum routine of your life might actually be anything but ordinary and ho-hum and routine, because you never know what God may be intending to do through it. You never know who he might be intending to bless and love and protect and provide for and extend his extraordinary faithfulness to through you just being ordinary and faithful in your regular routine of everyday life. I'll give you some examples to try to paint the picture. The kid that you just happened to teach the Bible and help explain the gospel to while serving in Midtown, who later gets baptized, and they now see and interpret their story in light of God's story, and you hear them use words that you helped teach them on sometimes rote, ordinary Sundays that felt like none of those toddlers were paying attention to a thing you said. And God just chance to use the cumulative effect of your ordinary faithfulness to bring them into his family. The employee or the customer or the neighbor walking their dog or the parent you're sitting next to watching your kid's sports game or event who just happens to be having a bad day when you decide to strike up a conversation with them. And you get to offer a little bit of joy, a little bit of encouragement, or maybe a prayer for them internally, or you say, hey, do you mind if I just pray for you? Or maybe you invite them into your home or into your life group rhythm. And that small act of kindness ends up being an embodied picture of God's kindness to them in the middle of their need. You don't know. You might do 1,000 and never see the fruit, and then one time, all of a sudden, God, you get to see it. That's one of the hard parts. We don't always get to see it. But you never know when he might be doing it. Your friend drifting towards sin's deceitfulness who gets pushed back to Jesus by the loving encouragement or the rebuke that you give them during Engage the Heart time at Life Group because you just happened to choose to go and not give in to the 10 reasonable excuses you had not to go, right? I know what life's like. It's busy. There's always reasonable reasons not to go, but you just happen to go anyway. And then God just chanced to use that moment to help encourage and push them back towards faithfulness in Jesus. The person who just happens to hear the gospel and has their eternity changed partially through your ordinary, regular presence and generosity in our church family. Like, I see some of y'all out there. Some of y'all, we do pass the peace and you're like, oh, I'm an introvert. I hate this part. I know you're out there. Some of y'all, we do pass the peace and you're like, why is it so short? Not just because you're an extrovert, but because you see that as an opportunity to meet people and to welcome them in and to be the embodied presence of God's extraordinary faithfulness to them through your ordinary faithfulness. It's beautiful. All the clients of our Serve the City partners who will happen to chance to get blessed by your service this upcoming Saturday at Serve the City weekend. And I love how y'all do it. Can y'all be out there and you'd be like shoveling and hammering, and it's like, oh yeah, and then we just had lunch with them. We decided to have lunch with the client and strike up a conversation. And every now and then, they're part of our life group now. And it's like, wait, what? How did that happen? Just happened to happen, huh? Just chance to chance. It doesn't always happen. I'm not saying it always happens. Most of the time it doesn't, but you never know when it might. You never know when God might choose that day, that moment of your ordinary faithfulness to bring about his miraculous salvation for people that he is chasing down. Now, there's an incredible word that Naomi uses in verse 20 when she says the Lord's kindness does not forsake. It's the Hebrew word hesed. I don't know if you're familiar with the term or not, but it's better translated as God's loving kindness, his loyal, steadfast, long-suffering covenant love. It's a powerful word throughout the scriptures that reminds us over and over that God keeps pursuing his lost children. No matter how they've sinned, failed, dishonored him, he keeps on showing faithful, patient, loving kindness, no matter how much any cultural moment looks like the days of the judges. When everyone's just doing what's right in their own eyes, when everyone's disregarding God, he keeps loving, he keeps pursuing, he keeps forgiving, he keeps sending his people through ordinary faithfulness to join him on his mission of redeeming and bringing back the lost, the foreigner, those in need, those who are spiritually impoverished, those who are physically impoverished. If you need the ultimate proof that the things in life that feel like chance are not actually, the best picture in history is the cross of Jesus. I don't know if you've thought about this or not, but that morning, some Roman soldiers just happened to wake up and clock into work. They were just doing their ordinary, heinous, violent job of criminal torture. But little did they know, as luck would have it, that morning, a few days before, hateful, self-righteous, and proud Pharisees demanded that Jesus be crucified, even if it meant releasing Barabbas the murderer. They thought they were crushing a rival upstart who was upsetting their power structure and their normal way of life, but little did they know. Pilate washed his hands rather than protect this innocent man, but little did he know that in the midst of all these chance happenings and actions, God was saving the world. God was showing off his hesed in the most incredible, the most unconditional, the most counter-conditional way ever imagined, at great cost to himself. Jesus in the garden, knowing he's going to the cross, like any human would, he asks God to remove the suffering from him that he knows he's about to go through. But well did he know, none of this was chance. Well did he know that his act of obedience and faithfulness would end up being God's miraculous faithfulness and protection and provision for millions and billions of people who would find their relationships with God reconciled, their sins forgiven, their hopes restored, their deepest spiritual needs provided for. Like Naomi, like Ruth. Let's pray.